Sometimes the eeriest stories come from the softest voices, children who speak with memories far older than they are. Whether they're reaching for something forgotten or remembering something they never lived, their words linger long after the moment passes. Welcome to Midnight Reddit, true stories that don't sleep. Turn down the lights, hit subscribe if you love scary stories, and share your own in the comments. My youngest, when she was about 4 or 5, used to talk about how warm and cozy it was before she was born, and how cold and frightening it felt the moment she arrived here. She said the hardest part was that she used to know everything, but now she doesn't know anything. I would just let her talk. You could almost feel how frustrated she was, like she was reaching for memories that were just out of reach. This one still stays with me. I'm 60 now, never had biological children of my own, but I'm a proud grandfather to several wonderful kids. I'm adopted, and my partner and I have been together for 28 years. Her kids now have kids. One day when my granddaughter was around 4, she went to her mother and asked, "What happened to Papa's babies?" There were 2 of them, but they're gone now. When I was about 13 or 14, my girlfriend at the time became pregnant, and there was a termination. She always said it had been twins. I never really believed her and never argued about it. Now in my old age, I think about my granddaughter's question a lot. I was the child in this case. I remember telling my mom when I was about 3 about my royal family. I still clearly remember standing in a desert near a shallow, dark pool at sunset. My younger brother reached down and splashed the water, and everyone around us became very upset, like he had disturbed something sacred. Years later, when I was 16, I met someone who became a close friend. When we were 18, we started talking about reincarnation, and he told me the exact same scene, only from the younger brother's perspective. I had never told him about my memory. It still unsettles me when I think about it. When my daughter was about 3, she kept saying the word specs over and over constantly. It felt so random and strange to me. Then my wife told me that her grandfather had worked for a company called Specs. He had passed away long before our daughter was born. She never met him. She would also say things like, "When I was an adult, I used to do XYZ," as if she was remembering another lifetime. I was the child in this story. I don't remember it personally, but when I was 4, we traveled to Ireland to visit my dad's grandparents. We were walking through a shopping area when I suddenly started shouting about wanting to see the train and ran into a shop. My parents chased after me into what turned out to be a clothing store. I was frantically looking around, insisting there was a train. The woman working there asked my parents what was going on. Finally, I yelled, "The train!" I had found at the back of the store a framed newspaper clipping from the 1940s showing the front window of that same place when it had been a toy shop, with a big model train display in the window. This happened between my wife and our youngest when she was about 3 or 4. Daughter: "I remember my old mommy." Wife: What? Daughter: "Like, I was born, and then I was really cold, but then I woke up, and you were my new mommy." Then she laid her head on my wife. Our youngest had a rough start at birth. She had complications, needed breathing support, and spent 2 weeks in the NICU. So, that conversation hit us a little differently. When I was about 4, my family went to see a house in a small village. It was right next to an airfield that had been very important during World War II, and there were old, disused shelters in the garden and nearby fields. Apparently, the moment I saw them, I ran to my mom, clung to her arm, and asked, "Are there going to be more attacks?" I became really agitated. No one in my family talked about the war. This was the 90s, and we didn't even have a TV. My mom says it really unsettled her. I've been told I look like the male version of my mom's grandmother, which is already strange. But people also say I act like her, talk like her, and even think like her. She passed away about 10 years before I was born, maybe more. and lived very far away. The unnerving part is that this doesn't just come from family. Random older people who knew her say it too. The creepiest example. As a teenager, we went to Disney in Florida. I was chatting with an older couple who were there with their grandkids. After a while, the woman said I looked and acted just like her old neighbor when she was growing up. Without really thinking, I suddenly blurted out, "Soy yo, Marisol?" At that point, she had never mentioned that name, and we didn't know she spoke Spanish, or that I did. She replied, completely serious, with a full name and the street in Buenos Aires where her neighbor had lived. I snapped back to myself and stammered that I was her great-grandson. My mom had chills and tears in her eyes. People with dementia who knew my great-grandmother have also called me by her name and tried to reminisce with me, and some of the things they describe give me a strong sense of déjà vu. At my grandfather's funeral, this happened several times with people I'd never met. One day I want to visit her hometown. She grew up near what was then Grodno, Poland, now Hrodna, Belarus, before moving to Buenos Aires during the Holocaust. Traveling there isn't easy, but I wonder what I'd feel if I ever stood where she once lived. I was a nanny for many years, and one little boy I looked after still stands out in my mind. He was 2, incredibly bright, and way ahead for his age. At bedtime, he liked to tell me stories. They almost always began with, "When I was an old lady." These weren't simple kid stories. They were detailed day-in-the-life accounts with words and concepts way beyond what you'd expect from a 2-year-old. Over months, he kept adding to this same storyline, always consistent. He even role-played as this old lady. He'd put a cloth over his head, walk slowly like his back hurt, pretend to go grocery shopping, or care for dolls like they were his grandchildren. He described having 4 daughters and a son, and several grandchildren. He said her husband passed away in his 50s from a lung condition, the same age as one of his uncles at the time. One daughter died in her 30s in a car accident, leaving 2 children that she took in with another daughter's help. He talked about having a bad back and pain in her feet, and that one daughter would rub her feet to help. He described the day she died, crossing a street, being struck by a car, people standing around her, where it hurt, and being lifted into a car and taken to the hospital, where she later passed away. We nannies compared notes and realized he was telling the same story to all of us. I even wrote it down for a while because I'd always been fascinated by the idea of past lives. He also described the house and neighborhood where she lived, a place very different from his own extremely wealthy, sheltered upbringing. He'd never seen that kind of housing or poverty. He also mentioned living near the sea. Months later, we visited a seaside city on the other side of the country. On the way to a family party, the driver got lost, and we ended up in a very poor neighborhood. Suddenly, the little boy started shouting and insisting we turn down certain streets. He began pointing out the window and saying he recognized things from when I was an old lady. The layout matched what he had described. We let him guide us, and he kept correctly predicting what we'd see around each corner. When we reached the spot where her house should have been, there was a store instead. The driver leaned out and asked an older person nearby what had been there before, and they said, "Houses." We never went back, and his parents were understandably uneasy about the whole thing. After that, we gently redirected him to other kinds of play. As he approached 3, the stories faded. By about 3.5, he didn't remember ever talking about being an old lady and thought we were joking. More than 25 years later, I still can't really explain it, especially since he had limited media exposure, highly curated TV, and we nannies were from different countries and rarely talked about anything that could have inspired those details. I was the kid in this one. Apparently, when I was 4, I had frequent nightmares. Each time it would start with me screaming the name Sarah, then calling loudly for help, waking everyone in the house. It ended with me sobbing and repeating, I'm so sorry, over and over. By morning, I never remembered a thing. My parents had no idea where this was coming from. They knew no one named Sarah that I had ever met. We had no TV, I wasn't in preschool yet, and I could barely read simple words. Nothing they tried stopped the episodes. This went on for almost a year, and then suddenly it just stopped. At one point, my mom asked me about it, and little me apparently said something like, Sarah doesn't want to see me crying anymore, so I won't. I didn't know any of this until years later, when I told my parents how I've always found the name Sarah beautiful. This happened to a friend's little sister. Their family had just bought a cottage near a ski village. They all went out for dinner at a restaurant there. As soon as they walked in, the little sister said, "I know this place. My mother and I used to paint here." Her actual mother said, "We've never been here before." "What do you mean?" The girl replied, "No, my mother from before. We used to paint here all the time." They brushed it off at first, thinking she was just playing. Later, when they were talking to the waitress, the little girl mentioned again that she used to paint there. The waitress told them that the building had indeed been an art studio for many years in the 1900s, only converted into a restaurant in the early 2000s. Everyone at the table, including the waitress, got chills. When our son was 3, my husband decided to treat him to a short flight over our city in a small plane. When it was time to get in, our son climbed straight into the pilot's seat and became very upset when told he had to move. He started crying and apologizing, saying he hadn't meant to cause a crash last time and that he would do better now. My husband calmed him down by pointing out that his legs were too short to reach the pedals. Once he was settled in the back, he got upset again because he couldn't use the radio. The pilot gave him a headset but didn't plug it in properly. Our son then tried to contact the tower to do a radio check and ask for clearance. The pilot had to step away for a moment. It clearly unnerved him. While the pilot was outside, my husband talked to our son, who said he had crashed the last plane he flew and that many people had not made it. When the pilot returned, they completed the flight without further issues. About a year later, we visited an aeronautics museum where an old Mosquito airplane was being restored. Our son told the curator he used to fly one of those. The curator kindly offered a tour of the plane. Inside, our son pointed out several things that were wrong, including the joystick style. The curator explained that the plane had been modernized and was now being restored to its original configuration. The details our son pointed out were all things scheduled to be changed back. He's grown now and doesn't remember ever talking about being a pilot before. He has no interest in planes, but he does remember a time when he just knew things about aircraft and how to fly them. My daughter talks about her grandson all the time. I assumed he was just an imaginary friend, but recently she came out of her room at bedtime, absolutely sobbing, and said, "I'm sad because I miss my grandson. He lives in my old house, in my old neighborhood." She has never lived anywhere but our current apartment. We've asked her questions about him. Sometimes she answers. Sometimes she treats it like a game. One night she said he sleeps in a crib and has a white tongue, which was a strange detail. Another time, when I asked his name, she said Guga and laughed. It could easily be imagination, but she has also said some unsettling things about the baby I lost a few months ago. That part really makes me wonder what she remembers or senses that we don't. This one is about my grandma's side of the family. Some of her siblings passed away in a house fire back in the 60s or 70s. About 30 years ago, my mom's sister was talking with a young cousin who was around 5. The cousin was extremely afraid of fire and acted a lot like one of my grandma's sisters, Tony. Then one day, when my aunt reached over to light a candle, the 5-year-old cousin said, "Isn't it funny how last time we were sisters, but now we're cousins?" It really shook my aunt. For context, 2 of my grandma's sisters lost their lives in that fire. My grandma told me this story about my dad when he was around 2 or 3. He told her once that he was almost born before, but he had been too sick and didn't make it, so he had to come back later. It turns out my grandma had experienced at least 1 pregnancy loss before he was born, likely due to birth defects caused by a medication she had been taking at the time. When he was around 3, my grandson used to talk a lot about his job at the ice factory. One day he was telling me about his boss, Farvo, and the day he decided to quit. I asked why, and he suddenly turned to me, full of emotion, and said, "I'll tell you why I quit. They made me work 15 days in a row without a break, and I had enough of that." Hearing that kind of righteous frustration from such a little boy was surreal. My daughter later reminded me he was only 3 when he would go on about working at the ice factory, which somehow makes it even stranger. My brother passed away after a serious illness affecting his brain. At the time, we had a calico cat who seemed to sense what he was going through. She was usually very unfriendly, but with him she was gentle. He would hold her paws and she would just let him. About 3 years after he passed, my parents had another child, another boy. When that boy was about 3, he told my parents about a white, brown, and black cat who used to let him hold her paws. That cat had passed away about a year before he was born. My son once told my parents all about Coco and Boo Boo. He was 4. He described the cats in detail. Coco and Boo Boo were my cats, and they had passed away 4 or 5 years before he was born. My mom showed him pictures of various cats we'd had over the years, and he picked them out immediately, saying Coco liked to knock things off tables. We had even nicknamed her Princess Knock It Off because she would push over anything she could reach. I didn't have photos of them at home, so he'd never seen them before. I hadn't really mentioned them to him either, because we had other cats by then. Coco and Boo Boo were litter mates and inseparable. My daughter is intensely afraid of fire. She once told me, the fire at school took my sister's life, and my other mom was really sad. When she started preschool at 3, they did a fire drill and she cried hysterically until it was over, and she was absolutely sure there was no real fire. I had to pick her up early. On the way home, she told me she was glad they practiced so that all the kids would be safe this time, unlike at her last school. I still think about that. My family and I were once driving through the countryside in Kent when my brother, who was about 3 at the time, suddenly said, "Mom, that was the field I died in once. Something sharp on a soldier's weapon went into my tummy." I was 8, and I remember wondering what exactly he meant by that. My parents looked at each other and asked him how he even knew what that sort of thing was. He said he didn't know and then became really embarrassed and quiet because of all our reactions. There was no way he should have known much about war or equipment like that. This was the early 90s and we hardly watched TV. I'm usually a skeptic, but this still unsettles me when I think about it. My child once told me about a dream where he was in heaven, or some place before he was born, with many men in suits. He said they had lined up every woman in the world and told him to choose who would be his mother. The part that really gave me chills was that I remember my own mom telling me I had described the exact same kind of dream when I was a child. When my younger sister was 3, she started telling our mom about, "When I was a big girl and you were a little girl." She claimed she had gone to our parents' wedding. She described what she used to look like, and my mom says it sounded exactly like her grandmother, Grace. My sister also talked about a greenhouse at the end of a dirt road, and how her mother back then, my mom's great-grandmother, Matilda, died from a snake bite while they lived there. She called the snake pretty, and when she described it, my mom thought it sounded like a copperhead. We lived in northern Nebraska, where copperheads aren't found, while Matilda had lived in the southeast Oklahoma, where they are common. My sister said she dealt with the snake using a hoe. These conversations always came up at bedtime. One day we were working in the garden. My dad was sitting and sharpening a hoe with a file when my sister told him he was doing it wrong. He asked her to show him, and she put her hands over his and moved them into the correct position. Later, he admitted she had been right. For reference, this was around 1980. My mom's grandmother Grace passed in 1968, and her great-grandmother Matilda died in 1902. We don't actually know if a snake bite was recorded as the cause of Matilda's death. I was 15 when my sister was having these nightly talks, so I remember them reasonably well. They went on for about 6 months, and by the time she was 4, she would just say, "I'm tired of talking about it," whenever it came up. Some memories fade and others never belong to this lifetime at all. But they linger anyway, carried by voices too young to understand what they're saying. What about you? Have you ever experienced something strange in the dark? Midnight fades, but the stories don't. See you next time on Midnight Reddit.